Okay, so continuing on with our character animation, we're now going to get the character from just in front of the ladder to all the way to the top of the ladder. And in doing this, we're going to see that the jumps on the ladder are going to be slightly different from our jumps when we're just bouncing along the floor, because I really want to give the impression of the character having to squash down and really propel himself upwards in order to make any kind of change in height on the ladder. So let's begin. I'm going to grab our character, and I'm just going to increase the range that we're dealing with and scroll along so that we're dealing with the next section of the animation. Now, with the jumps, I've worked out timing wise that I'm going to use around 20 frames per jump, and in each jump I'm going to go up around 3 rungs, and that works nicely timing wise, I feel. So we come to a halt at around 305, so around 20 frames after 305 I want to be up on 3 rungs up our ladder. So let's take and scrub to around 325, and we do have auto key on, so if I now move in Translate Y and in Translate X, we're going to set keyframes in both of those. Now if we were just to leave that in place, we're going to see that we just float to the rung. And
it doesn't look very natural. It's a very
that's very undesirable.
space-like way of jumping onto the ladder. Exactly.
So what I want to do is basically have the ball bounce off the floor, go up higher than it needs to, and then come to basically settle down on the rung. So around, I don't know, just slightly after halfway into the jump, I want to move up higher than the rung that we're going to settle onto, so that we move up and then we settle back down. Now that alone is not going to be enough to give us the nice smooth motion we're after, so I'm going to shift middle click on Translate Y to scope the Translate Y channel, H to home up on that curve, and we can see that we've got a very floaty animation curve. So let's deal with getting this guy to look a little bit cleaner. So to do that, I'm going to take the tangent handle that's going into that jump and make sure that it's got a nice instant change in acceleration. I'm going to take the tangent handle for the end of the jump, select it, and untie the tangent so that we can do the same for the end of the animation. And then I'm going to take this keyframe, move it in time by clicking on the actual keyframe itself, and change its tangents just to get, in combination with this tangent down here, a nice smooth curve that leaves the jump. We accelerate in Y. Under gravity we're going to start to decelerate, but instead, where on these jumps we come right back down to the level that we left off with, here we only come back down to the rung that we were after, so we're going to jump up and then settle on the rung.
I take that ending tangent right there on the last keyframe and just kind of move it out to the right just a hair. There you go.
Something like that?
Yeah, just to kind of clean up the arc.
And this actually brings up an interesting point. You'll notice that even though our keyframe is set with a Translate Y value of 11.46, our curve goes higher than that value. So just because our keyframe is there, that does not mean that that's going to be our maximum value, because the way we've got our tangents, our curve is actually going to go higher than that and then settle back down. Now also with these jumps, I want to have the ball hold in Y, which means we're going to see a hold in the Y value over time for a few frames after every jump, and that's because when we come to animate the squashing and the stretching, the ball is going to squash down after impact, almost as if he's preparing himself for the next jump. So we're going to jump, pause for a bit, jump, pause for a bit. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to move to our last keyframe by clicking on the go to next keyframe, which is at 325. I'm just going to move, say, 3 frames after 325, and alt left click on Translate Y to set another key. Now if we shift middle click on Translate Y, H again to home up, you'll now see that after our jump we're going to hold that Y value for a few frames, because we're not changing vertically, so we're not changing our Y value, but we are changing over time. And that's just going to allow us to, when we come in and animate the squash and stretch, we can add just a little bit more impact to the animation, almost as if the ball is preparing himself for each jump. Now this jump here with the hold is going to be pretty much the same thing for all of the rest of the jumps going up the ladder. So we're going to take around 20 frames to go up every 3 rungs. We're going to go up higher than we were after, come back down and settle, hold for a bit, and then repeat. So I'm just going to throw in the keyframes for Translate Y first, then we can come in and tweak all their tangent handles, and then we can just go back through and sort out our squash and stretch, etc.
Sounds good to me.
Cool. So let's go forwards in time around 20 frames, so we're on 328, so let's move to, say, something like 348. I'm going to move up 1, 2, 3 rungs on the ladder. I'm then going to come back somewhere just over halfway and move up a rung higher than we were after. Cool. And then when we're on our last keyframe, I'm going to step forward, say 3 or 4 frames, and Alt left click to key our Y value again. And I'm just going to repeat this for the rest of the ladder. So let's jump forward 20 frames-ish. So 352, let's go to around 370. And move up 1, 2, 3 rungs on the ladder. And then just after halfway, move up higher than we were after. And then hold for a few frames, Alt left click to key. So 390, 1, 2, 3 rungs up. Back to just after halfway, move up a rung higher. Cool. And then a few frames and hold. Let's go to around 410 or so. 1, 2, 3. Back to around halfway, up a rung higher, to our final key, a few frames on, so 1, 2, 3, Alt left click on Translate Y to hold that value for a bit. And then let's just extend this just a tad, so 414, let's go to 430, 1, 2, 3. Back to just after halfway, go up a rung higher, go to our last keyframe, a few frames on and Alt left click to hold. And then our final jump, so to around 450, up to the top of our ladder, and just before halfway, let's go up higher than that value, go to our final keyframe, step forward a few frames, and we'll hold that value. So now if I shift middle click on Translate Y to scope and push H to home up, we've got all our keyframes in place, but you'll notice that due to our tangent handles, our curve does not look the same as this first section. It's going to be nice and simple to go in and change this. First, I'll deal with the tangents going into and out of our jump. We need to give this instant acceleration and deceleration as before. To do that, I'm going to shift select all of the tangents for those keyframes. So I'm shift selecting the tangent handles by holding shift and left clicking on those handles. So grab the last couple, and I'm going to click on untie the handles. So now that the handles are untied, we can go back in and just give the curve the shape that we're looking for and tweak any of the tangents and positions of the keyframes in between to shape out those curves. So I'm going to bring this back slightly, maybe take some weight from that, something like that, and repeat for here. So I'm just changing the tangents to give the shape of the curve that we're looking for that defines our motion in Y that we were after. There's really nothing to it, it's all just about looking at the curve, seeing how clicking on and dragging on the tangents is affecting the curve, and just moving them until you're happy with the end result. So I think this is our last one we need to do. Let's move. So yeah, something like that. So if we now close and were to replay this animation, so I'm going to rewind and play. We jump up and settle, jump up and settle, jump up, settle, nice. All the way to the top of the ladder. So that's that Translate Y taken care of. Now let's go in and give some squash and stretch to really add life to that animation. So what we're going to do when we're holding on Translate Y, we're going to be squashing down. And that's going to be our preparation for the jump. And then just before the peak of the jump, we're going to stretch out in Y, just like when we had our jumps in the previous video, almost as if we're throwing our weight into the jump, we're throwing our weight upwards. So let's find our first jump that doesn't have any squash and stretching. So there does. So this jump, so we need to throw our weight up just before the peak of the jump. So let's grab squash and stretch. Again, recalling that I do have auto key set. So that's going to give us a keyframe there, and then as we come down on the first keyframe, I want to be zeroed out by that point. And then as we go to the next keyframe just before jumping, I did click on the move to next keyframe button. We can now squash down. So what that's going to do, we're going to jump up and stretch into the jump, come back. When we land, we're going to squash down, ready for our next jump. So now, just before the peak of the jump, so here's the peak of the jump, I'm going to stretch out. As we move over, we're going to come back down on the first of our translate Y keyframes. I want to zero out our squash and stretch. And then by the next keyframe, so I click on the next keyframe button, we want to squash down in preparation for our next jump. And that's very simple, we're just going to repeat that for the rest of the jumps. So just before the peak, we're going to stretch out. On the first of the translate Y keyframes for our hold, we're going to zero out. On the next of those, we're going to squash down some. Just before the peak, we're going to stretch out. 0. And undo, grab our character. So 0, and then make sure I am on the right keyframe. There we go. So on that final keyframe for the hold, squash down. Just before the peak, stretch out. 0. And squash down. Should just have a couple more jumps to do. So just before the peak, we're going to stretch out, throwing our weight into the jump, pushing our character upwards. Oops. Alright, so stretch out. No! So you want to find that keyframe. There we go, so that's our first keyframe for the hold. We're going to zero out. On the next keyframe, we're going to squash down slightly. And then for our final jump, just before the peak, we're going to stretch out. And then we're going to zero out on the first keyframe for the translate Y of the hold. And on the last keyframe, we're going to squash down, ready to begin jumping onto the diving board. So if we're to watch that back, rewind and watch that back, you'll see there's a lot more energy now in that jump. It really looks like he's pushing himself up the ladder. So that's most of the animation there. It would be nice to add a little bit more subtlety with our bend, so that as we're jumping up before the peak, we're going to lean back slightly, almost as if we're pushing ourselves off the ladder. Going into the peak, we're going to throw our weight forward, we're going to bend forward, and that should bring us back to the ladder. But that's going to look weird if we stay in the same position in Translate X. So we're also going to animate Translate X very slightly to move us back away from the ladder when we throw our weight backwards, and move us back towards the ladder when we throw our weight forwards. So let's animate the bend first. So on this normal jump, we want to bend backwards as we leave. So let's grab the bend. Backwards as we leave, forward slightly after the peak, and when we land, we're going to zero out. Then here, as we are just about to leave for the jump, I want to set another keyframe at 0. Just before the peak, I want us to have our character bend backwards slightly. And as we go over the peak of the jump, he's going to throw his weight forward slightly. And then when we settle, that's going to zero out. And again, on the next keyframe, I'm going to set another keyframe at 0. So I'm just going to repeat this for all the jumps, but you'll see what's going to happen is he jumps up, he's going to lean backwards, lean into the jump, and settle. So we're just going to repeat for all the jumps. So as he jumps up, we're going to lean backwards slightly. Over the peak of the jump, we're going to throw our weight forwards, and then we're going to settle on the next keyframe. Left click to set another keyframe at 0. So before the peak, we're going to throw our weight backwards, into the peak, throw our weight forwards, then settle. Key that again on the next translate Y. So weight backwards, into the peak, weight forwards, and settle. And again, set another keyframe at 0 there on the second of the two translate Y hold keyframes. So just before the peak, weight backwards, into the peak, weight forwards, and then settle. So we settle. So I do want to zero out. It looks like I've put that keyframe very close, so let's zero out on that keyframe. Come forward slightly and actually throw our weight forwards earlier, because I'd put those keyframes a little too close to the translate Y, so I've just readjusted that so it's matching what we were doing earlier. That's nicer. So here on the final jump, just before the peak of the jump, weight backwards. Into the peak of the jump, we'll throw our weight forwards, and then finally come to settle. So 0 there, 0 on that keyframe. Nice. So if we were to watch that back, we're going to have a little bit more life, but because of the lack of translate X animation, things are going to look a little bit weird. But we are just going to add just subtle translate X animation so that when the character's throwing his weight backwards, he'll move backwards slightly. When he throws his weight forwards, he'll move forward slightly, but it is going to be extremely subtle. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to scope our bend so that we can find where we've keyframed weight forwards. And when we've keyframed our weight forwards, I'm going to key our translate X value a few frames after that value at the current translate X. I'm then going to look to see where we've thrown our weight backwards, and a few frames after that I'm going to move our translate X just out slightly. And what that's going to do is going to basically give us the feeling that when we throw our weight backwards, that is then causing a few frames later our mass to move backwards, because that motion has now taken effect over our mass and the direction the mass is moving in. And the same when we throw our weight forwards, that's then going to take effect and move us back in the other direction. So I'm going to scope our bend parameter just so that we can see the keyframes down here on our play bar. So I'm going to shift middle click on bend and close that out so we can now see our keyframes for the bend. So let's step through those keyframes. So here we are sat on our position, and I want to find the bend where we throw our weight forwards, and just a few frames after that I'm going to key translate X by alt left clicking so that translate X is at its current value, because I'm happy for that for being the finishing position. So let's do the same. So step through where we've thrown our weight forwards, step forwards just a few frames and key translate X and repeat. So we've thrown our weight forwards, step forwards just a few frames and key translate X. Thrown our weight forwards, step forwards a few frames, key translate X. Thrown our weight forwards, step forwards a few keyframes, key translate X, and repeat for the very final jump. So we've thrown our weight forwards, step forwards just a couple of frames, and key translate X. So we've got the keys for the returning to its original position. Now let's go through and key a few frames after we've thrown our weight backwards, just moving slightly back in X. So I'm going to move back to where we're starting ascending the ladder. So we've thrown our weight backwards, so I do want to make sure that translate X just before that point is keyed at its current value. So we've thrown our weight backwards. A few frames after that, I'm simply just going to pull translate X back very slightly. So then we return. We've thrown our weight backwards. Just a few frames after that, I'm going to pull just back slightly on translate X. And repeat. So a few frames after, pull back very slightly on translate X. And again for the very final jump. So a few frames after, pull back slightly on translate X. So now if we were to watch all of that play back, we're very subtly moving our weight forwards and backwards when we bend forwards and backwards. And with that, unless there's anything you'd like me to add to the animation of the character climbing the ladder, that's going to be everything for this particular video.
No, I think that looks pretty good. Thanks a lot, guys.